Okay, so picture this. You come home after a long day, just ready to crash, and you open your door, and there it is, water pouring down from your ceiling.
Oh, no.
Right. Your furniture's soaked. That rug you love is, well, it's a literal puddle. It's like every renter's worst nightmare.
It's a disaster.
It is a total disaster. And the culprit, you ask, it's a burst pipe, but not even your own plumbing. This time, the leak is coming from the apartment upstairs. I mean, come on.
Huh.
So yeah, suddenly moving into a bubble doesn't sound so bad, right?
Right.
But okay, here's the thing that maybe, just maybe, hasn't even crossed your mind in all of this chaos.
Yeah.
Is your renter's insurance actually going to cover the cost of, a hotel while your place is getting fixed up?
That is such a good question. And I think a lot of people would be surprised that, yeah, in many cases, it really can.
Really? See, this is why I wanted to do this deep dive. For something that feels so essential, renter's insurance can be a total black box sometimes.
Absolutely.
So we're talking
Yeah.
specifically about something called loss of use coverage, right?
Exactly.
What is that?
Yeah. So loss of use, sometimes it's called additional living expenses coverage. Basically, it's this thing that's designed to help with all the unexpected costs that come with living somewhere else, temporarily, when your place is just not livable. Like you can't stay there because of some kind of, covered event.
Okay, so let's really break this down because this is important. So let's just say my apartment is definitely considered uninhabitable, right? We're talking
Yeah.
burst pipe, fire, major issue. How long would this loss of use coverage actually pay for me to be in a temporary place?
Yeah, good question. And you can forget those, like, hotel voucher images, the ones that get you like a week, right?
Right.
Depending on the specific policy you have, this coverage can actually last for months. Like, we're talking sometimes even up to a year or even 2 years in certain cases. I mean, you think about it, right? Like, if there's a fire, the average time it takes to repair a home can be something like 7 months. So this is not insignificant.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, that's a huge relief to hear because you never know what could happen. And just knowing you actually have that kind of time to find your feet again,
Mm-hmm.
it makes a world of difference when you're dealing with like a major life disruption like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's peace of mind.
But let's be real, right? Like this coverage, it's not going to suddenly put me up in some luxury penthouse suite if, say, my little basement studio decides to flood.
No, it's not a free upgrade.
Okay, good.
It's really about getting you into a comparable living situation. So think about it, like similar size to what you had, similar kind of neighborhood, the same sort of amenities. So if you don't have laundry in your unit, you're probably not going to get a unit with laundry in it, things like that. It's about making sure that you have a place that's safe, that's comfortable, while everything's getting fixed up in your own place.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about like maintaining your standard of living, not necessarily, a free vacation upgrade.
Right, exactly.
But I'm curious, what about all the other expenses that, inevitably come with a sudden move like this?
Right.
Like, what about restaurant meals if you don't have a kitchen to cook in? What about, like, laundry services or even, like, pet boarding if your temporary place isn't cool with Fido coming along?
Yeah. No, you're thinking about this the right way. Those things add up. And yeah, loss of use can help cover some of those additional expenses. It's not just about putting a roof over your head. It's about, like you said, helping you keep your life as normal as possible during what is probably a pretty stressful time. But, of course, there are limits. Insurance always has its limits. So, it's super important to check your specific policy.
Right. Always read that fine print. Okay, so we've talked about what this loss of use thing actually covers, but I imagine there are some pretty specific situations where it's actually going to kick in. What are those?
Yeah, absolutely. Remember those perils we talked about?
Yeah.
Think of them kind of like the villains in the renter's insurance world. They're like those unexpected events that can really mess things up, and they're usually what triggers this coverage.
Perils. I love that. It sounds very dramatic.
It does.
So what are some of the big ones? Like what kind of events are we talking about?
So water damage, like that burst pipe we were talking about earlier, that's a big one. But this is where it gets a little tricky. If the water damage is, from something internal, like a pipe bursting inside your building, you're very likely covered. But if it's flooding from like a hurricane or a huge storm, something like that, then you usually need a separate flood insurance policy.
Wow. So it's not as simple as, oh, it's water damage, so I'm covered. There are nuances to it.
There are, yeah.
Okay. What about something like a power outage? So let's say my building loses power for days after a big storm. Would that qualify for loss of use coverage?
Another great question. And again, it really depends. It all comes down to, what caused it and how your policy actually defines these things. So, for example, if there's a huge blackout and it's because of a major storm and it's like widespread, that might not be covered. But if there's an outage for an extended period and it's due to some electrical problem in your building specifically, that could be a totally different story. So it's so specific.
It seems like the common thread here, and it's probably pretty obvious, but it's so important. Read your policy.
Yeah.
Like, really read it. Don't just assume you know what is or isn't covered.
Yes, 100%. And if anything is unclear, even a little bit, just call up your insurance provider. Ask them. I mean, it's always better to be safe than sorry.
I love it. This has been great. We've covered a lot today. This whole conversation, it's got me thinking, what happens if you need to break your lease for a reason that's not covered in the insurance policy?
Yeah.
Like, what if you have to relocate for work, or there's a family emergency or something like that? Any advice for renters if they find themselves in that situation?
Oh, that's a really good point. That's a whole other can of worms, actually.
Right.
It's a whole other deep dive. But yeah, there are things you can do. You might be able to negotiate with your landlord, see if there's any wiggle room, or maybe subletting is an option. There are definitely avenues to explore.
Yeah. It sounds like we have an idea for a future episode. But until then, for everyone listening, hopefully you're enjoying a dry and very drama-free living space. But the main thing to remember here is that renter's insurance, especially this thing we're talking about, this loss of use coverage, it's way more comprehensive than a lot of people think. It's there to give you a safety net during those unexpected and honestly stressful moments in life.
Yes, exactly. And, when it comes to these things, a little peace of mind goes a very long way.
I totally agree.